Hello, I hope you can hear me. And first of all, thank you for choosing to be here in this speaker series. And well, I am Mariana Jiménez. I am an alumni from Select program. As you can see in this very lovely picture, I graduated last year. And since then, I've been working in Mexico as an energy industry analyst and journalist. So I've been putting together a report on Mexico's electricity industry that is based on statistics, analysis, and also interviews with over 180 stakeholders from the electricity sector. And so for me, this experience has been really interesting because Mexico is undergoing a very super huge transformation, passing from a state-owned monopoly industry to a free market. And this has implied building the industry completely from scratch. And I'm very happy to say that renewable energies have played a very important role in the making of this new electricity sector. And so how to achieve more integration of renewables into our system has been key in the conversations we have been having with actors from the industry. And so for me, one of the aspects that was very interesting is that, in fact, social acceptance of projects is one of the biggest barriers that we are facing to reach the targets that we have of producing 35% of our electricity from clean energy sources by 2024. So in general, as a Select student, we focus mostly on what are the technical and economic challenges, but I think sometimes we underestimate how really important is to get these projects accepted by people, no? And so this is the aspect that I want to discuss with you today. And so one thing that we must distinguish, which is particularly a problem that is very high in renewable energies, because we have different levels of social acceptance. And in general, we can say that renewables enjoy very high levels of sociopolitical acceptance. For instance, in the case of Mexico, that we have policies especially done to support renewables, and also if you make surveys, most people will say that they are pro-wind energy, they are pro-solar, they are pro-geothermal, etc. And also we have reached the point and we have very high market acceptance as renewables are very competitive. Even we have a power auction last year and solar and wind got most of the megawatts that were bidded in this auction. But the level that I'm talking today, it's more related to the local acceptance of a specific project, the so-called community acceptance. And while I was doing research for this talk, I found out that this is a problem that is not only happening in Mexico, and in fact, it has been identified by several studies as being one of the most powerful barriers that we will face to reach the clean energy targets that we have to maintain the climate change in the levels that we want to have it, no? And so we have seen cases, for instance, in the US, here's a protest against a solar park in a Californian desert. We have examples also in Canada, in the UK, and in so many other countries, no? And well, in general, as in fact Diego Pavia was mentioning yesterday, this kind of rejection from local citizens to project development that are good for the society as a whole, but might cause discomfort or have certain negative impact at the local level, it's known as the not in my backyard syndrome. But here, what I want to discuss, because most of us are renewable energy supporters, sometimes have problems like understanding why people does not want to have these projects on their lands. And even in the media, very often people that reject this project is qualified as ignorant or selfish or uninformed. But what I want us to do today is like to look a little bit beyond, because if we don't understand why is people rejecting this project, then we cannot develop the strategies to make this project accepted, and so we can reach our targets. And today, I want to talk a special case that is very important in Mexico, as in many other countries, that is building projects in indigenous communities. And I decided to go for these specific cases because generally in indigenous territories it's much more complex for project developers to get the acceptance of the community, because indigenous people in general tend to have more deep connections with the land than non-indigenous communities. And well, just some facts for you to know. There are 370 million people in the world that identify themselves as indigenous. That's 5% of the population. They live in 90 countries, and most of them, which was very surprising for me, live in Asia, so around 70%. And another thing that is very specific of building projects in indigenous territories is that having the community's approval is not only a good practice to follow, but it's generally mandatory by law. So if you don't have the approval of the majority of the community, you simply cannot just go ahead with your project, no? And so as I was mentioning, in Mexico, the interaction between indigenous territories and large energy projects is very important, as we are the country in Latin America with the highest population of indigenous communities. At this moment, we have around 17 million people, which is about 50.1% of Mexicans that are identifying themselves as indigenous. So that is Mexico. And so for me personally, I also wanted to discuss this topic because I consider that, and it was also mentioned by the United Nations, that we cannot talk about development, and we all know renewables are good, like to foster economic development and so on, but we cannot really achieve these targets if we do not include all the groups of our population. So for a country like Mexico that has this very large cultural diversity, it's very important that we learn how to communicate to these people and how to bring them on board of this energy transition. And so another important fact that is very very important to know is that even though indigenous communities are 5% of the population, their territories and land hold around 80% of the total Earth's biodiversity. So this makes them a very key stakeholder on the use of natural resources, as can be hydropower plants, geothermal, solar, and wind power. Okay, and also another very important aspect that we need to consider is that at the moment, the majority of the growth in renewable energy projects is taking place in emerging markets. So as here the director of the International Energy Agency is mentioning, we are passing the shift from having the growth mainly in Europe, in the US, to emerging markets. So most of these large infrastructure projects will be built in India, in China, in Mexico, in Argentina, etc. And in this kind of markets is where most indigenous people live, no? So it's also another very interesting point to consider. And well, so what should you do when you are working with indigenous communities? In these cases, the main guidelines that project developers need to follow can be found in the 169 Convention of the International Labour Organization. So here, if you can consult it later, you have all the guidelines that you need to follow when you want to build a project in an indigenous territory. And it's not only for energy projects, but it's for mining, for large roads, etc. And one of the most important aspects that it includes is that the process to obtain the community's consent must be followed the principles of being free. So it has not to be any external or internal pressure. It has to be previous, which means that it's the first step that you need to do before starting any type of construction. And it should be informed, which also means that the community should have access to all the information they need to make an informed decision. And so this, for all the factors that I was mentioning before, that we are having every time more interaction and collaboration between these indigenous territories and energy projects, there are many initiatives that are being taken to ensure that project developers are following the adequate processes. And one of the most important ones is the so-called Equator Principles that has been developed by financial institutions, and it's adopted by 84 already in 35 countries, which represent 70% of the international project finance debt that exists in emerging markets. So this means that when a project developer wants to get financing for the project, they must to ensure that they are following these principles. But still, as sometimes happen, even in projects that are being financed by these kind of institutions, there have been some cases when they still do not follow the adequate guidelines, and there have been so many dropbox, and particularly we will see one case in Mexico, and this impacts very negatively on the development of renewable energies. So today, I want to compare just between two different cases. One is in Mexico, and the other one is in New Zealand, just to make this note, because I presented to a friend and he said, it's not only because in Mexico there was bad cases, but it was easier to get the documentation for this one and the good case in New Zealand. But there are good and bad cases in both countries. So in the case in Mexico, It's a project that is going to be built in a state called Oaxaca, which is the state in Mexico with the highest percentage of indigenous communities. And it's a region where Icots and Vinisas communities live. And in the case of New Zealand, it's a project that is going to be built in a Maori territory. So in both cases, communities or the lands are managed by the entire community. So this is something that is very important when working with indigenous groups, because in most other cases, you usually buy the land from one person, so you just need to convince that person, pay them, and that's okay. But in indigenous communities, the land is owned by the entire territory, by the entire community, and then you need to convince at least half plus one of it, no? So in both cases, the project developer must get the approval of half plus one of the community. So in the case of Mexico, we are talking about a wind farm that is going to be 396 megawatts, consisting of 132 wind turbines, and if constructed, it will be the largest wind farm in Latin America. And in the case of New Zealand, it's a geothermal power plant of 130 megawatts capacity, and also if constructed, it will be the largest single unit geothermal power plant in the world. So in both cases, as I was mentioning, in general, indigenous groups tend to have very deep connections with their lands and the natural resources that are found there. And for example, in the case of Mexico, the wind farm is supposed to be built in this region. And this lagoon, which is formed from seawater, has a very special significance for all the communities that live around. Because first, fishery is the main economic activity, so they mostly earn money from fishing shrimps and fishes, but also there are some places in this area that play important roles in religious and cultural events of all these communities. And in the case of New Zealand, also it's very important to note that geothermal resources have been present in their culture since very long time, and there are many mentions to geothermal energy in their myths and oral traditions. And it's also very interesting that this concept of Kaitiakitanga, sorry for the pronunciation, it's very related to sustainability. It refers to the fact that they have to take care of the resources so the next generations can also make use of them. So it's, in both cases, like both communities have very deep connections, and this was, well, is a challenge for the project developer. So let's see how it went the case in Mexico. So first, the project developer went to the federal government and obtained approval for the project. It also contacted the authorities at the state's level and also the municipality. Then it went to several financial institutions and got financing from some banks, including some development banks that follow the Equator principles that I was talking about. So afterwards, they reached the community and they tried to explain the project to them and whether they wanted to build this wind farm, and they were going to pay a certain amount of money for them, like giving them permission to use this land. But the community raised a lot of concerns because they were really worried that the wind turbine's vibration was going to affect the fishes and shrimps, and they will have experiencing shortage of their fisheries activities, no? And so the company tried to convince them that no, there is no impact at all, and the community contacted also some local experts, and they said there might be some impacts. So there were like, no one was really convinced about there was no impact at all, but the company still decided to go ahead and talk with the municipality leaders and just get the permits and start construction. But as the community was not really convinced that the project was going to be beneficial for them, they got super angry when they saw that the project was starting to be constructed. So they started some protests, including blocking some roads, so the company could not pass the equipment to start constructing the wind turbines. And there was also some internal conflicts because a small share of the population was actually supporting the project. So there were like fights between the people that was supporting and the people that was not supporting. And it took like 2 years, like this conflict. Here is one picture of one of the protests that they got like some people from the other communities. And so in the end, the company decided to make a court case. So the police could stop the community and they could go ahead with the construction.
But in fact, the judge found that there were many inconsistencies because, as I mentioned, in the case of indigenous communities, it's not an option to get the community's approval, but it's mandatory by several international regulations and also Mexican law. So as the company could not prove that it has at least the support of half plus one of the community members, the judge decided that the project was illegal and it was going to be canceled. So in the end, they got the project completely canceled, even though they had already made some investments, so they lost some $100 million. In New Zealand, on the other hand, the company first started talking with the community, then it got with the senior leaders. This community is organized in a trust fund, so they designate some people and they take decisions that are going to benefit the entire community, but always also getting the support of the other members, but they are kind of the representatives. So the company contacted these senior leaders, and then they finally made an agreement that the company was going to get the technical support and the initial investment, while the Maori community was going to give the land, and the trust will help them to get the support from the community members. So the trust went to communicate to the members what was the project about, what were the positive, but also the negative impacts, which is also very important, and what were the strategies that was going to be put in place so they could mitigate these negative potential impacts. And in the end, they managed to get 95% approval of the community, and it was also done in record time, in around 9 months, even though this process might take up to 24 months. So they finally decided to get more involved, as the community does not want it to be only a land leaser, but they wanted to be a partner of the project. So they decided to go for a joint venture, and then went to financial institutions. The company got their financing. The Maori members also got financing to buy their equity share. And finally, the project started construction in 2010 and operations in 2010, becoming the largest single unit of geothermal power plant in the world, and still making New Zealand one of the countries that produces more geothermal energy. And just to sum up a little bit, what was the impact of these both cases? In Mexico, this case was very famous, and it has in fact made very uncertain investment of wind energy in Oaxaca, which is a pity because it's one of the regions in the world with the best wind resources. So it has average wind speeds of 12 meters per second, while most regions, for instance, Denmark, has around 6, more or less. And it has also acted as a domino effect, and other communities, when project developers go and say, hey, what about building a wind farm in your land? And they say no, we heard about what happened in the other community, and we prefer just not to have any problems, go away. And this has led also to loss of economic development opportunities, which is also very sad because Oaxaca is one of the states in Mexico with the lowest index of development. And it has also given some bad image to renewable energy projects and developers in Mexico. While in New Zealand, on the other hand, this success has motivated new geothermal developments. Even in the same Maori territory, there is already another project that is being constructed, and it has encouraged other Maori people to get involved, not only as land leasers, but as partners of the project, and participate in the construction of this clean energy in New Zealand. And this particular project, of course, contributed to energy independence because New Zealand does not have its own, let's say, oil and gas resources, and it also contributed to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And so, even though these things might seem a little bit obvious, of course you have to talk with people and you have to get agreements with them. For instance, in Mexico, when we were doing, or the government was doing all these new regulations, they found out that 80% of the companies, including national and international corporations, did not actually have any social strategies in place. Some projects were successful, but it was a matter of luck or because the community just accepted, but most of them did not think in advance, okay, what can we do to get these communities on board? So this is the message that I want to share with you today. It's not how to do it, but just to keep in mind that there are more reasons why people does not want to have renewable projects, and it's only because they are kind of selfish, And if we try the right strategies, we can get them on board, and we can make the energy transition that we all hope for. So that will be all. I don't know if you have any questions. questions?
So for the wind energy project, which didn't work in Mexico, what kind of benefits was the organization offering for the indigenous people? So what would be their benefits if it was built? And yeah, more or less that was the question. And the same for the New Zealand project. What did these people get from the thing? And the second one, are these people have the electricity and everything both in Mexico and New Zealand now, or they just live without these facilities?
Well, in the case of Mexico, and in general, as I was saying, like communities' land work very differently. So it's not very regular that they sell the land, but they kind of rent it. So they were getting some, I don't remember the exact quantity, but for example, it was like 3 times less what some landowners get in the US, no? So it was some Mexican pesos per hectare, and it works per year, so they get like kind of a rent, so the company can have the wind turbine then. And I think it's also one of the issues here that most people think that by paying money, you will get like community's approval. And for instance, in the case of Oaxaca, they do have electricity, but it's one of the regions where it's more expensive. And people there does not earn that much money. So it would have been maybe a better approach to have a parallel like distributed generation program so they could have access to, let's say, solar panels, no? Instead of just giving some money. And also here, the other problem was that the money was given to the leaders and not all the community members were receiving like their share, no? So that also kind of pushed like conflict. And in the case of New Zealand, because they are partners of the project, they also get access to some of the shares of all the revenues that the project is generating. So this company produces energy, it sells it in the market, and a share of these revenues is given to the trust fund of the Maori people that they decide in which they want to spend the money of, like in a new school or in a new road or whatever.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question. What's your opinion about the new energy laws in Mexico? Do they really help and encourage renewable energy projects in the country in order to avoid situations like this, for example?
Yeah, in fact, now when you are trying to develop a new project in Mexico, it's mandatory by law that you show that you have made this social impact assessment. So, and in the case, if you are working in indigenous territories, you have to show that you have identified what are the groups that live there, what are their traditions, how your project will impact their ways of living. But I mean, when the government announced that, in fact, I must say that most companies were not happy with that because they see this as a barrier and more bureaucratic processes. And maybe it is, but it is also kind of necessary. So I think it was a very good step from the Mexican government to put this as a mandatory requirement and not just leave it at the company's decision if they want to do it or not. But of course, it also needs like kind of cooperation because you can do like a very simple report and just to meet the requirement. But if you don't understand that it's actually something that you need to do to ensure your project is successfully built, then it's worth nothing, no? So it's good for the government, but we also need to get the companies on board.
I would like to know, if during your studies did you find out that is corruption making a big impact in this type of projects in Latin America, in Mexico in particular, and in Latin America?
Well, I think of course, like in most cases, corruption is a big problem. For instance, in this particular case, the company got the permits even though they didn't have the approval. So they just say like, yeah, we have the approval, and no one really checked with the community like, is it true or no? And the leaders just say like, yeah, because maybe they were getting some of the highest benefits. And of course, it is a big problem that I think most of emerging markets are facing, but I think it's not only responsible of the country itself to fight this, but as I was saying, most of the companies are international, no? So they are not Mexican, and then corruption comes from both sides.
One of the things you mentioned that besides the corruption of getting the permits, but the main concern of the people that was opposing this project was because they were not sure about the environmental impact that this project would have for the fishing mainly. How or what I'm not sure if there is any conclusions on what on your research, or what would you suggest would be the right way to approach this towards the indigenous community to mitigate or answer their questions or concerns about the impact?
Well, we have interviewed many consultancies that help companies with these issues. And one of the things that they say is that most companies are really afraid of communicating the bad impacts. They always want to share the good things, but it's very important that you are open about the bad impacts and better told them what are you going to do to mitigate these bad impacts, instead of just telling, no, there will be no impact, is everything happy and we will all be very happy with this project. It's like, no, okay, this might happen, but we are taking this and this and this action, so this potential negative impact is going to be mitigated. So what most consultancy says is that companies need to speak also about the negative impact and better develop the right strategies to address these issues. And in some cases, I would say that if you find that there is a very strong environmental impact, then don't go with the project. Because not because something is renewable, it means that it's green. And it's something that is also very confusing against people and that we must be very aware of. Some other question?
Are you aware of any project like this being built or in the process in Mexico? And the other question would be, how do you suggest to approach to these kind of people in order to convince them to build the projects in their communities?
Well, first, yeah, we have many wind farms that are going to be constructed in the next 2 years. But in fact, because of this and other cases, most of the project developers decided to move to the north. So Tamaulipas, which is also like more desertic area, so you have less interaction with people. And even though they don't have as good wind resources as Oaxaca, which is really like a super windy place, it's just easier for them because it's more like the regular transaction that you just buy the land from someone and just talk with the neighbors and stuff like that. And the other question, yeah, well, what I like very much about the New Zealand case is that it was a very participatory process. And I think that is also that needs to change, that we, or project developers must start seeing communities most as partners of their projects and not just the people that I'm renting the land from, no? Because as much as the people feel involved and they feel kind of certain feeling of ownership, it is much likely that they will accept the project construction.
I wanted to ask if there are any kind of good practices. I guess it depends on the location and everything, but if there are any good practices about how to address local people, not just, local communities like in this case, but in general, because also, in Europe it's a huge problem, social acceptance of this kind of projects, and if, besides trying to talk with them early on compared to the actual, design of the project and everything. Do you know about how, in general, companies that are working in this sector try to get in touch with them? Because I guess most of the people have a reasonable suspicious mind about like big companies going there and trying to make money out of their land and this kind of stuff.
Well, in general, as good practices, I couldn't say exactly if there is like some guidelines or whatever. Most consultancies that work with this, they just say like is communication, and the most important thing is to do it as early in your project planning as possible. That are like the two key features that in general, but then I suppose you have to adapt depending on what are the local conditions. And regarding your second question, which was about
Just basically the same.
yeah, like how these companies address, no? Yeah, for instance, I don't know, just to give an example of one thing that was not working really well is that, yeah, companies, sometimes they send representatives to these communities to present the project and talk about the good things that it will bring. But for instance, in the case of renewable indigenous communities, sometimes they send people that only speak Spanish. And there is people there that does not speak Spanish. So then there is like some miscommunication and blah, blah. So another thing that I think was very positive from the New Zealand project is that they first approached some senior leaders from the community, and then the connection through the other members was done through these people. So they know how to talk with them, and they were also accompanied by experts on technical and commercial aspects, so the community could answer all their questions, all their concerns. I think, in general, most of the things are kind of, I would say, like not rocket science, but it's just to acknowledge that people has the right to make their own decisions and to participate in the process. And if you make it feel like an imposition, it's like everybody. Like, you don't like to be imposed things, no? If you feel like you are making the decision, if you have the chance to decide whether or not it will be done, then you feel more likely to accept it. Something else? Well, thank you.